The Arizona sky burned crimson as Alexander Harrington stepped out onto his sprawling mansion's terrace. He adjusted his custom Patek Philippe watch, a small fortune on his wrist that he barely noticed anymore. 5 young boys, in identical, worn clothes, stood at his gates, their faces so similar it was unsettling. Security was about to send them away when one child looked up and said something that would shatter Alexander's world. "Our mom said you're the only one who can save us now. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Alexander Harrington's empire cast long shadows across Phoenix's skyline. At 42, he commanded Harrington Technologies with the precision and detachment of a battlefield general. The crystal decanter on his office desk caught the late afternoon, light as he poured himself 2 fingers of 18-year-old scotch, a ritual marking the completion of his latest acquisition. "Celebration seems in order," remarked David Wells, his CFO and oldest friend, accepting a glass. "Hardly worth celebrating," Alexander replied, his voice carrying the practiced indifference that had become his trademark. Parker Dynamics was undervalued. The board practically gave it away. The acquisition had added another $3 billion to Harrington's net worth, a figure that had long since lost meaning to him. The financial press called him the Desert Wolf, a predator who consumed struggling companies with ruthless efficiency. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Harrington, Ms. Reynolds is calling about the charity gala tomorrow evening," his assistant's voice announced. "Tell Catherine I'll pick her up." "At 7, he replied without emotion. David raised an eyebrow. "Wedding's in 3 weeks. Shouldn't you sound more enthusiastic about your fiancée?" Alexander shrugged. "Catherine understands our arrangement." Both men knew the truth. His engagement to Catherine Reynolds, daughter of Senator James Reynolds, was strategic, a merger of influence and power. She brought political connections, he brought billions. Love had never entered the equation. "The prenup negotiation finished this morning," Alexander added, staring out at the mountains beyond his office windows. "Her father tried to include provisions for children. I had them removed." "Still firm on that decision?" David asked carefully. "Nothing's changed." Alexander's tone made clear the subject was closed. The doctors had delivered the verdict 9 years earlier. Alexander was sterile. A childhood illness had left him unable to father children, a fact he'd accepted with the same stoic pragmatism he applied to business decisions. He'd never wanted a family anyway. His own childhood had been too fractured, too painful to consider replicating. "Speaking of tomorrow," David said, changing the subject, "the presentation for the board is ready. Wilson from R&D thinks the new neural interface could revolutionize medical tech. Have legal prepare the patents," Alexander replied. "I want everything locked down before development advances further." The intercom buzzed again. "Mr. Harrington, security at the main gate needs to speak with you." Alexander frowned. Security never called him directly. "Put them through." "Sir," came the tense voice of his head of security, "there are 5 children at the front gate. Boys, they're asking for you specifically." "Send them away," Alexander said dismissively. "Sir, they've been here 3 times this week. They won't leave until they speak with you. They say it's about Elena Martinez." The name struck Alexander like a physical blow. His hand tightened around the crystal glass. "Sir?" the security guard prompted. "I'll be down in 5 minutes," Alexander said, his voice betraying nothing. David watched his friend's face carefully. "Elena Martinez. Wasn't she the research assistant from 8 years ago?" Alexander cut him off. "She left the company suddenly. I haven't heard that name since." "And now kids are showing up at your gate?" David asked. Alexander was already moving toward the door. "I'm sure it's nothing." The estate's main gate stood half a mile from the mansion itself, a massive wrought iron barrier set in adobe walls that surrounded the 100-acre property. Alexander's Bentley purred along the private road, kicking up small clouds of desert dust despite the meticulously maintained surface. As the car approached the gate, he saw them, 5 small boys standing in a perfect line, eerily identical in appearance. They wore clean but visibly worn clothing, their dark hair neatly combed, their postures unnaturally straight for children who couldn't be more than 7 years old. Alexander's security chief, Mason, stood awkwardly beside them, relief washing over his face as the Bentley arrived. "They won't leave, sir," Mason explained as Alexander stepped from the car. "I told them you weren't available, but they insisted." Alexander approached the gate, studying the children with the analytical gaze that had dissected countless business proposals. 5 identical faces stared back, their eyes a distinctive amber that struck a chord in his memory, regarding him with equal intensity. "Who are you?" Alexander demanded, addressing all 5 simultaneously. The child in the center stepped forward. "My name is Lucas. These are my brothers, Ethan, Noah, Caleb, and Joshua." The boy spoke with startling articulation for his age, his voice clear and measured. "Our mother is Elena Martinez," Lucas continued. "She said, if anything happened to her, we should find you." Alexander maintained his composure, though his mind raced. "What do you mean, if anything happened? Where is Elena now?" "The hospital." Another boy, Ethan, Alexander thought, said quietly. "She's been sick for months. Yesterday the doctor said she won't get better." "She gave us this before the ambulance came," Lucas added, holding up a worn envelope through the bars of the gate. Alexander nodded to Mason, who retrieved the envelope and handed it to him. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small USB drive. His eyes scanned the first few lines of Elena's handwriting, a script he remembered from research. "Notes years ago. Alexander, if you're reading this, my condition has worsened and I've sent the boys to you. I never intended for you to know about them, but circumstances have forced my hand. They have nowhere else to go. What I did was wrong. I can see that now. But these 5 innocent children shouldn't pay for my mistakes. The drive contains everything. The how and why of what I did. You deserve to know the truth years ago. They are your sons, Alexander, genetically, completely yours. The tests on the drive will confirm it. I'm sorry." Elena Alexander's face remained impassive as he folded the letter and slipped it into his jacket pocket. 8 years had passed since Elena Martinez had worked in his company's genetic research division. 8 years since she'd vanished without notice, taking valuable research data with her. "Open the gate," he instructed Mason. "Sir?" the security chief questioned, surprised. "Open it. And call Dr. Phillips. Tell him I need him at the house immediately for 5 DNA tests." As the massive iron bars swung inward, Alexander studied the 5 identical boys. Their faces, his face, he now realized with a shock, stared back with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "You'll come with me," he told them, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "We'll sort this out." The boys exchanged glances, some secret communication passing between them before they nodded in unison. They moved with military precision, following Alexander to the Bentley and arranging themselves silently in the back seat. As the car pulled away, Alexander caught David's questioning gaze in the rearview mirror. He gave an imperceptible shake of his head. Later. They would discuss this later. His phone vibrated, Catherine calling again about tomorrow's gala. Alexander silenced it without answering. His perfectly ordered world had just tilted on its axis, and the 5 identical boys sitting behind him were the cause. Alexander Harrington, the man who had built an empire by controlling every variable, found himself facing the most unpredictable situation of his life. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered the impossible. The sterile billionaire might be a father after all. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Alexander's mansion seemed to swallow the 5 small boys as they entered the grand foyer. Marble floors stretched beneath a crystal chandelier that cast fractured light across their upturned faces. They stood in perfect formation, shoulder to shoulder, taking in their surroundings with identical amber eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Sullivan!" Alexander called, and his housekeeper appeared immediately, her expression faltering only slightly at the sight of the 5 children. "Sir?" she asked, her professional composure quickly restored. "These boys need a place to stay, temporarily. Prepare the East Wing guest rooms," Alexander instructed, then addressing the children, "Mrs. Sullivan will show you where you can clean up. Dr. Phillips will be here shortly." Lucas, clearly the designated spokesperson, nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington." The formality in the child's voice was disconcerting. Alexander watched as Mrs. Sullivan led them away, 5 small figures moving with synchronized precision like miniature soldiers. "Want to tell me what's going on?" David asked when they were alone. Alexander withdrew the letter from his pocket and handed it to his friend, then inserted the USB drive into his laptop. The screen filled with medical files, research data, and a video file labeled "For Alexander." "Play it," David urged, having finished the letter with a low whistle. Elena Martinez's face filled the screen, thinner than Alexander remembered, her once vibrant complexion now sallow. She sat propped against hospital pillows. "Alexander," she began, her voice raspy. "By now you've met the boys. I owe you an explanation." Elena coughed before continuing. 8 years ago, I was part of your company's genetic research division. We were working on revolutionary fertility treatments involving genetic editing. The potential was extraordinary, helping people who could never have children, including you." She paused, gathering strength. "I discovered your medical file while organizing research parameters. I knew you were sterile, that you'd accepted it as an unchangeable fact. But our research suggested otherwise." Alexander's hands tightened into fists as Elena continued. "I approached you with a proposal to include your case in our research. You refused, saying you had no interest in children. The project was personal for me. I'd always dreamed of having a family, but couldn't due to my own medical issues. When you shut down the entire division a month later, claiming ethical concerns..." Eleanor's eyes hardened with remembered anger. "I took the research and samples we'd collected from you during routine company health screenings. It was wrong. I know that now." David shot Alexander a shocked glance as the implications became clear. "I perfected the treatment using my eggs and your genetic material. I never intended to have quintuplets. The procedure was experimental. All 5 embryos survived. They were born 7 years ago." The video showed Elena reaching for a glass of water, her hand trembling. "I named them and raised them alone." "They're brilliant, Alexander. Their aptitude scores are off the charts. They've been reading since age 2. They speak 3 languages. And their capacity for mathematics..." She smiled weakly. "They're your sons in every way. Your intellect, your focus, even the way they tilt their heads when they're thinking. It's all you." Alexander's face remained impassive, betraying nothing of the storm within. "I've been diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia. The treatments aren't working. When I'm gone, they'll have no one. My parents are dead, and I have no siblings. Despite how they came to be, they deserve a chance." Her voice broke. "They're innocent in all this." The video ended with Elena looking directly into the camera. "They are Harringtons, Alexander. Whatever you decide to do, please remember that." Silence filled the study as Alexander closed the laptop. His mind methodically processed what he'd learned, compartmentalizing the shock and unexpected emotions. "Behind walls of logic. She stole your genetic material," David finally said. "Created children without your knowledge or consent. That's criminal," Alexander finished flatly. "Yes." "What are you going to do?" Before Alexander could answer, a discreet knock announced Mrs. Sullivan's return. "Dr. Phillips has arrived, sir, and the boys are waiting in the east sitting room." Dr. Phillips, Alexander's personal physician for over a decade, carried a medical bag and an expression of professional curiosity. After a brief explanation, the doctor's eyebrows rose almost to his hairline. "I'll need to take samples from all of them, and from you again, Mr. Harrington," he said. "The initial results will be ready in a few hours, but detailed genetic mapping will take longer." "Do it!" Alexander ordered. "Complete confidentiality, as always." The east sitting room had been transformed by the presence of the 5 boys. They sat with perfect posture on brocade chairs, freshly washed, their dark hair still damp. Mrs. Sullivan had found clothes for them, identical polo shirts and khaki pants that hung slightly too large on their small frames. Alexander studied them clinically. The shape of their eyes, the angle of their jaws, the slight cleft in each chin. He recognized himself in every feature. Dr. Phillips approached with gentle professionalism, explaining the cheek swab procedure to 5 solemn faces that showed no fear or confusion. "It doesn't hurt," he assured them with a warm smile. "We know how DNA testing works." One of the boys, Noah, replied matter-of-factly. "Mom explained genetics to us last year." The doctor's smile faltered slightly as he proceeded with the collection. "When can we see our mother?" Lucas asked. Alexander directly once the doctor had finished and left the room. "Tomorrow," Alexander answered, "if the hospital allows it." "They will for you," Lucas said with absolute certainty. "You're Alexander Harrington." Something about the child's unwavering confidence unsettled Alexander. These were not normal 7-year-olds. Their vocabulary, their demeanor, their self-possession, all were years beyond their age. "Are you hungry?" he asked, suddenly aware they might not have eaten. 5 heads nodded in unison. An hour later, Alexander watched in fascination as the boys ate with perfect table manners in his seldom-used, formal dining room. Mrs. Sullivan had prepared a simple meal of chicken, vegetables, and rice. The boys ate methodically, without childish complaints or preferences. "Mom made sure we eat balanced nutrition," Ethan explained, noticing Alexander's observation. "Proper brain development requires adequate protein and essential fatty acids." "And we always eat together," added Caleb, the quietest of the 5. "Mum says shared meals build stronger familial bonds." Alexander felt a strange hollowness in his chest. Elena had raised these boys with scientific precision, creating children who spoke like little adults and moved with coordinated grace. The result was both impressive and profoundly disturbing. "Where are your things?" he asked, realizing they had arrived with nothing. "Our apartment was small," Joshua explained, speaking up for the first time. His voice was softer than his brother's, though identical in timbre. "Mom said we could only bring necessities. Our books and clothes are in backpacks by the door." "Backpacks," Alexander repeated. 5 small backpacks to contain their entire lives. His phone vibrated again. Catherine, for the 5th time. With a resigned sigh, he answered. "Alexander, finally. The gala committee needs to know about the seating arrangement, and your tux fitting is scheduled for—" "Catherine, something's come up," he interrupted. "I won't be attending the gala tomorrow." A beat of surprised silence followed. "You're joking. The senator is bringing 3 major donors specifically to meet you." "It's unavoidable," Alexander said, watching the 5 pairs of eyes that tracked his every movement. "Family matter. Family." Catherine's voice sharpened with suspicion. "You don't have family, Alexander. That's why our arrangement works so well, remember? No messy family entanglements." The irony wasn't lost on him. "I'll explain later," he said, and ended the call. As night fell, Mrs. Sullivan showed the boys to their rooms, 5 identical guest suites in the east wing that had never housed children before. Alexander stood in the hallway, watching as each boy carefully placed a small backpack at the foot of a king-sized bed designed for adults. "Will you be here in the morning?" Lucas asked. a hint of vulnerability finally breaking through his composed facade. 2. Question caught Alexander off guard. "Yes," he found himself saying, "I'll be here." After the boys were settled, Alexander returned to his study where David waited with Dr. Phillips. "The preliminary results are conclusive," the doctor announced without preamble. "All 5 boys share your exact genetic profile. They are, without question, your biological children." "That's impossible," Alexander stated flatly. "I'm sterile." Dr. Phillips adjusted his glasses. "According to these results, and Ms. Martinez's research notes, she developed a technique to bypass your condition. She essentially created clones using your genetic material and her eggs, then modified the embryos to remove her genetic contribution and duplicate yours. It's unprecedented." "It's illegal," David interjected. "Yes," Dr. Phillips agreed, "but it's also a scientific breakthrough. These boys are genetic carbon copies of you, Mr. Harrington. Your sons in every biological sense." Alexander dismissed the doctor with instructions to continue the detailed analysis. When they were alone, David poured them both a drink. "You need to call your lawyers," he advised. "This is a legal nightmare, not to mention what it could do to the company's stock if it gets out." "Tech billionaires. Stolen DNA creates quintuplets" isn't exactly the headline we want. Alexander stared into his untouched scotch. "They're children, not a PR problem." "Children you never wanted," David reminded him. "Children created without your consent by a woman who stole from you. You don't owe them anything." But as midnight approached and David finally left, Alexander found himself walking down the quiet hallway to the east wing. He stopped at each doorway, looking in at 5 identical sleeping forms in 5 identical beds. In the last room, Joshua, the quiet one, wasn't asleep. He sat by the window, staring out at the desert night. "You should be sleeping," Alexander said softly from the doorway. The boy turned, his face solemn in the moonlight. "Mom said you build things that change the world." Alexander stepped into the room. "Some people think so. She said we're like you, that we'll build important things too someday." Joshua looked down at his small hands. "She made us for that." The words landed like stones in Alexander's chest, created with purpose, designed for greatness. The weight of such expectations on 7-year-old shoulders. "Your mother is very ill," Alexander said carefully. Joshua nodded. "Terminal stage leukemia, survival rate less than 10%. His voice remained steady, but his eyes betrayed his grief. "We calculated the probabilities." Alexander found himself sitting on the edge of the bed. "What do you want to happen now, Joshua?" The boy considered the question with a seriousness no child should possess. "We want to stay together, all 5 of us." "And what about me?" Alexander asked. "Mom said you might not want us," Joshua replied with brutal honesty. "She said you never wanted children, but she also said you were the most brilliant man she ever met, and that you always make logical decisions." "And what would the logical decision be here?" Joshua met his gaze without flinching. "To learn more before deciding. That's what you taught your companies to do. Mom read us the article in Forbes." Alexander felt something shift inside him, respect perhaps, for this small person who spoke his language of careful calculation. "That's reasonable," he agreed. "Get some sleep now." As he closed the door, Alexander heard Joshua's voice once more. "Mr. Harrington, thank you for not sending us away." Alone in the hallway, surrounded by doors containing children who shared his DNA, his face, perhaps even his mind, Alexander Harrington confronted the uncomfortable truth. For the first time in his carefully controlled life, he had absolutely no idea what to do next. Dawn broke over the desert with characteristic drama, painting the sky in fierce oranges and reds. Alexander stood at his bedroom window, watching the colors bleed across the horizon after a night of little sleep. The detailed DNA analysis had arrived by encrypted email at 4 a.m., page after page of scientific confirmation. The boys were genetically his, with only trace markers of Elena's contribution. His phone chimed with an incoming text from Catherine. "Emergency meeting with wedding planner today. Your absence yesterday created problems. Call me ASAP." Alexander silenced the phone without responding. The carefully planned merger of fortunes and influence that his engagement represented seemed suddenly trivial compared to the situation unfolding under his roof. When he entered the kitchen at 6, he was startled to find all 5 boys already seated at the breakfast counter, dressed identically in their 2 large borrowed clothes. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," they chorused with perfect synchronization. "We maintain a consistent wake-up time," Lucas explained, noting Alexander's surprise. "Mom established our circadian rhythms when we were infants." Mrs. Sullivan bustled about the kitchen, clearly delighted to have children to fuss over. "These young gentlemen have been helping me prepare breakfast," she informed Alexander. "They're quite skilled with the fruit salad." "Knife skills are important for fine motor development," Ethan said seriously, as if quoting from a parenting manual. Alexander found himself unsettled by their unchildlike behavior. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, attempting normal conversation. 5 heads nodded in unison. "Your house has 24,282 square feet of living space," Caleb observed. "We calculated it from the architectural proportions. Our apartment was 850 square feet. "That's quite accurate," Alexander acknowledged, wondering if all children their age could make such calculations, or if this was another sign of their unusual development. "We'd like to see our mother today," Lucas reminded him. The group's appointed leader focused on their priority. Alexander nodded. "I've made arrangements. We'll go after breakfast." The hospital room was private, the best money could secure. Elena Martinez lay against white pillows, her once vibrant beauty hollow under the harsh fluorescent lights. When the 5 boys entered, her face transformed with love. "My stars," she whispered, opening her arms. The boys broke formation for the first time in Alexander's presence, rushing to surround their mother's bed. They didn't clamber onto it as normal children might, but stood around it with perfect posture, each taking one of her hands in turn to kiss. Alexander remained by the door, an outsider witnessing a ritual of love that made his chest constrict. Elena's gaze finally found him over the heads of her sons. "You came," she said simply. "They arrived at my gate yesterday," he replied, stepping into the room. "You didn't leave me much choice." Elena smiled weakly. Still direct as ever, she turned to the boys. "Would you give us a few minutes to talk? Mr. Harrington and I have important matters to discuss." Without protest, the 5 filed out to where David waited in the hallway. When the door closed, silence stretched between the former colleagues. "They're extraordinary," Alexander finally said. "Yes," Elena agreed, a flash of pride breaking through her exhaustion, "beyond all my expectations." "What you did was criminal," he stated flatly. "Corporate espionage, theft of genetic material, unauthorized human experimentation." "I know." She met his gaze unflinchingly. "I didn't ask for your forgiveness, Alexander, only your help." "Why?" The question that had kept him awake all night. Why create 5 identical children without consent? Was it revenge for shutting down your division? Eleanor shook her head, wincing at the movement. "No, it was more complex than that." She adjusted her position with difficulty. "I believed in our research. The techniques we were developing could have helped millions with fertility issues. When you shut us down, I was desperate to prove the concept worked. Using my DNA, yes, you were the perfect test case. Someone with a specific fertility issue our technique was designed to overcome." Her voice grew stronger as she explained. The research was my life's work, Alexander. I couldn't let it die. So you stole from me and disappeared. Eleanor looked away. I never intended to have quintuplets. The procedure was experimental. I implanted 5 embryos expecting most to fail. When all 5 developed, a smile touched her lips. It was a miracle, my miracle, and yes, your DNA provided the perfect blueprint. You designed them, Alexander observed, recalling Joshua's words from the night before. You raised them to be like me. I enhanced what was already there, Elena corrected. Their intellectual capacity, their focus, their aptitude for patterns and systems. That's all you, Alexander. I simply provided the optimal environment for development. The clinical way she discussed their creation sent a chill through him. They're not experiments, Elena. They're children. Her eyes flashed. They are my sons. I've loved them every day of their lives. The burst of emotion depleted her, and she sank back against the pillows. But you're right. They deserved better than to be part of my scientific ambition. I see that now. What do you want from me? Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer. They have no one else, Elena said simply. No family, no guardians. When I'm gone, you expect me to take 5 children I never wanted into my life, to suddenly become a father. I expect you to make the rational decision, Eleanor replied. They're Harringtons, Alexander. Genetically, they're you, your intelligence, your potential. Can you really walk away from that? Alexander felt manipulated, cornered by her logic. You had no right. No, she agreed. But they have every right to a future. They're innocent in this. Before Alexander could respond, the door opened and Dr. Winters, Eleanor's oncologist, entered with a tablet in hand. Mr. Harrington, the doctor, acknowledged with surprise, I didn't realize Ms. Martinez had company. He's the boy's father, Elena said, the simple declaration landing like a thunderbolt in the room. The doctor recovered quickly. I see. Well, I need to discuss Ms. Martinez's latest results with her. Perhaps you could... He can stay, Elena insisted. He needs to understand the timeline. Dr. Winters hesitated, then nodded. As you wish. I'm afraid the new scans show the cancer has spread to your liver. The experimental treatment hasn't slowed the progression. Elena received the news with calm resignation. How long? Weeks. Perhaps a month. The doctor's voice was gentle but clinical. We should discuss hospice options. Alexander watched Elena absorb her death sentence with the same composure her sons had displayed in his mansion. She simply nodded, asked a few precise questions about pain management, and thanked the doctor. When they were alone again, Alexander found himself at a loss for words. The anger he'd carried into the room had dissipated, leaving confusion in its wake. I didn't plan for this part, Elena admitted, a bitter smile playing at her lips. Dying before they grew up, before I could see what they would become. Outside, in the hallway, Alexander could see the 5 boys through the window, sitting in perfect alignment on a bench. They weren't fidgeting or complaining like normal children forced to wait. They simply sat, patient and composed, like miniature executives awaiting a board meeting. They deserve a childhood, he said suddenly, surprising himself. Not just an education or opportunities, an actual childhood. Elena's eyes filled with tears. I know, I tried, Alexander. Between the research and raising them alone, she trailed off. They've never had friends their age, never played sports or joined clubs. Their entire world has been each other, me and their studies. Alexander turned back to her. Why did you really create them, Elena? The truth. She held his gaze for a long moment. Because I believed combining my scientific mind with your visionary genius could create something extraordinary. Because I wanted children who would change the world. She paused. And because I loved you once, before ambition consumed us both. The confession hung between them, unexpected and unwelcome. The boys don't know how they were conceived. She continued, they believe it was a traditional fertility treatment. Please, let them keep believing that. Alexander's phone vibrated again. Catherine calling now, no longer content with texts. He silenced it without looking. I need time to think, he said finally. Elena nodded weakly. I don't have much time to give, I'm afraid. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. 5 lives balanced against the carefully constructed world he'd built. 5 children who shared his DNA, his intellect, perhaps even his capacity to reshape industries and technologies. May we come back in now? Lucas called from the doorway, ever the spokesman for his brothers. Elena brightened immediately, her focus returning to her sons as they filed into the room. Alexander stepped back, watching as she asked about their night in the mansion, listening intently to each boy's precise report. Mr. Harrington has a laboratory in the West Wing, Noah informed her with evident excitement. Mrs. Sullivan told us. And a library with over 10,000 books. Is that so? Eleanor smiled, glancing at Alexander. Perhaps he'll show you sometime. Alexander found himself nodding automatically. If you're interested. 5 faces turned to him with identical expressions of barely contained enthusiasm. The first truly childlike reaction he'd seen from them. We would calculate the optimal shelving system, Ethan suggested seriously, and catalogue everything by subject and publication date, added Caleb. Alexander almost smiled. In their own way, they were attempting to be useful, to earn their place in his world through the skills they possessed. I'll make arrangements for your mother's medical care, he told them, needing space to process everything. David will bring you back to the mansion when you're ready. As he turned to leave, Elena called after him. Alexander, thank you for bringing them. He paused in the doorway. 5 identical boys clustered around a dying woman's bed. A family he had unknowingly helped create. A family now looking to him for salvation. I'll be in touch, was all he could manage before escaping to the hallway. Outside the hospital, Alexander loosened his tie, feeling as though he couldn't breathe. His phone rang again. Catherine, for the 7th time that morning. With a resigned sigh, he finally answered. Where are you? She demanded, without preamble. The senator is furious about last night, and we have the menu tasting at 3. Alexander stared back at the hospital windows, knowing that somewhere inside, 5 boys who shared his DNA were saying goodbye to their mother. Catherine, he said slowly, there's something we need to discuss. Catherine Reynolds waited in Alexander's study, her elegant figure silhouetted against the panoramic desert view. She turned as he entered, her practiced smile faltering at his disheveled appearance. Alexander, what is going on? First you miss the gala, then you're unreachable all morning, and now David tells me you've cancelled your meetings for the week. She approached, perfectly manicured hands smoothing his collar. The wedding is in 19 days. This isn't the time for mysterious disappearances. Alexander gently removed her hands from his shirt. We need to talk. Catherine's expression shifted, political instincts honed from childhood, detecting the gravity in his tone. I'm listening. I have children, he stated, opting for direct truth. 5 of them, 7-year-old boys. Catherine blinked, processing his words. That's not possible. You're sterile. It's complicated. Alexander moved to pour himself a drink, needing something to occupy his hands. A former researcher at my company used experimental techniques and my genetic material without consent. Are you saying she stole your DNA? Catherine's voice rose slightly before she regained control. When? 8 years ago. And you didn't know about these children until now? Suspicion colored her voice. I learned of their existence yesterday when they appeared at my gate. Their mother is dying, Alexander explained, watching Catherine calculate this new information with the precision he'd once admired in her. This is absurd, she finally declared. Surely there are legal remedies. This woman essentially committed a crime against you. Alexander nodded. Yes, she did. Then we'll handle it. Catherine's voice took on the efficient tone she used for campaign planning. Daddy's legal team can arrange everything quietly. The children can be placed with suitable families, compensation provided, documents signed. No one ever needs to. And no. The clinical way she disposed of 5 lives in a few sentences struck Alexander forcefully. It was exactly how he would have responded a day earlier. They're my biological children, he said slowly. Created without my knowledge or consent, yes, but still my DNA, my genetic legacy. Catherine studied him with growing alarm. You can't possibly be considering keeping them? 5 children? That was never part of our agreement? I'm aware. We discussed this extensively during the prenup negotiations, she continued, gesturing emphatically. No children. A clean merger of assets and influence without messy familial complications. That was the plan. Plans change, Alexander replied simply. Catherine's composure slipped further. You expect me to become an instant mother to 5 boys I've never met, to derail my political future with unexpected stepchildren. This is insanity, Alexander. Before he could respond, the study door opened and David appeared with the boys in tow. 5 solemn faces regarded Catherine with identical, curious expressions. I'm sorry to interrupt, David said, clearly uncomfortable. The hospital visit ended. Earlier than expected. Catherine stared at the children, her professional smile failing to materialize for the first time in Alexander's memory. The boys stood in their usual perfect formation, hands clasped behind their backs, unnervingly still. Catherine, these are Lucas, Ethan, Noah, Caleb, and Joshua, Alexander introduced, gesturing to each boy in turn. You're Mr. Harrington's fiancé, Lucas observed. We saw your engagement announcement in Forbes. The article estimated your wedding would cost $4.7 million. Catherine's eyes widened slightly. You read Forbes? We read everything, Ethan explained matter-of-factly. Our reading level was assessed at collegiate level last year. See? Catherine turned to Alexander, with a look that clearly communicated we need to talk alone. Mrs. Sullivan has prepared lunch, Alexander told the boys. Why don't you head to the dining room? We'll join you shortly. The boys filed out without argument, though Alexander noticed Joshua lingering just a moment longer, his observant gaze, moving between the adults before he followed his brothers. When they were alone again, Catherine dropped all pretense. This is a disaster, she hissed. Do you understand what this will do to our merger? I mean marriage. I haven't made any decisions yet, Alexander replied, though he recognized something fundamental had already shifted inside him. Let me be clear, Catherine said, stepping closer. I agreed to marry a billionaire technology visionary with no family entanglements. Not a man with 5 identical children created through some science fiction scenario. My father won't accept this. The political implications alone. I understand your position, Alexander interrupted, and I'll respect whatever decision you make regarding our engagement. Catherine studied him with the shrewd assessment that had made her a formidable political operative. You've already chosen them, she said, realization dawning. I can see it in your face. I haven't. Don't lie to me, Alexander. I've spent my life reading people. You've known those boys for one day, and they've already changed you. She removed her engagement ring with deliberate slowness. I won't compete with children I never wanted for a man who's suddenly discovered paternal instincts. She placed the 8-carat diamond on his desk. I'll have my things removed by tonight. My father's office will contact yours regarding the dissolution of our agreement. Alexander watched her walk to the door, feeling oddly unburdened. I'm sorry, Catherine, she paused, her hand on the doorknob. No, you're not. That's the strangest part. With that final assessment, she left, her heels clicking efficiently down the hallway toward her former future. Alexander found himself alone in his study, staring at the abandoned engagement ring. The wedding that had been years in strategic planning dissolved in minutes. The carefully constructed future he'd envisioned, gone, and yet he felt none of the regret or anger he might have expected. He made his way to the dining room where the boys sat at the large table, eating with their characteristic precision. They looked up in unison as he entered. "Miss Reynolds won't be joining us?" Lucas asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "No," Alexander confirmed, taking a seat at the head of the table. "Our engagement has ended." 5 pairs of identical eyes watched him with unsettling perception. "Because of us," Joshua said quietly. Alexander considered lying, then decided against it. These children had been raised on scientific accuracy and clinical truths. "Yes, in part," he acknowledged. "Catherine and I had an agreement that didn't include children." The boys exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. "We understand cost-benefit analysis," Lucas stated. "Our presence creates more costs than benefits for your planned merger." The business-like assessment from a 7-year-old struck Alexander as both impressive and profoundly sad. "Relationships aren't just about costs and benefits," he found himself saying. "They're more complex than financial mergers." Ethan tilted his head. "Mom said emotions complicate logical decisions. She taught us to prioritize reason over feeling." Alexander absorbed this, recognizing Elena's scientific approach to parenting. "Your mother is very intelligent," he said carefully, "but emotions are part of being human. They have value too." "Like how Mom cries sometimes when she looks at us," Caleb suggested. "She thinks we don't notice, but we do." "Precisely," Alexander agreed, touched by this glimpse of normal childhood observation. "Will you send us away now?" Noah asked, voicing the question they clearly all wondered. Since Miss Reynolds left, Alexander looked at each boy in turn, these genetic mirrors of himself who had been created without his knowledge, but who now sat at his table, awaiting his verdict on their future. "No," he said firmly, "you'll stay here while we figure things out." Subtle relief passed across 5 identical faces. After lunch, Mrs. Sullivan approached Alexander with practical concerns. "The boys need proper clothing, sir, and school supplies. And I suppose we should think about schooling arrangements." Alexander, who had navigated billion-dollar negotiations with ease, found himself overwhelmed by these mundane considerations. "Make a list of everything they need. We'll arrange for shopping." "And their education, sir?" Mrs. Sullivan pressed. "What grade are they in?" he asked, realizing he didn't know such a basic detail. "We don't attend traditional school," Lucas answered, overhearing the conversation. "Mom homeschooled us using an accelerated curriculum. We've completed material through 8th grade already." Alexander stared at them. "You're 7 years old, and you've completed 8th grade work?" "Mom said, our cognitive development is accelerated." Ethan explained, "We complete 1 standard grade level every 4 months." Mrs. Sullivan looked as shocked as Alexander felt. "Well," she managed, "I suppose we'll need to find appropriate educational materials then." "Our curriculum is in our backpacks," Caleb offered. "Mom made sure we brought all essential learning materials." Alexander's phone rang, David calling from the hospital. He stepped away to answer. "She's asking for you," David said without preamble. "The doctors say her condition has deteriorated rapidly. If you're going to speak with her again—" "I'll be right there," Alexander replied, ending the call. He found the boys in the library, already organizing books into neat stacks according to some system they'd devised. "I need to go back to the hospital," he told them. "Your mother is asking for me." 5 heads snapped up in alarm. "We want to come too," Lucas insisted, an unusual note of emotion in his voice. Alexander hesitated, recalling how clinical their earlier hospital visit had been. "Your mother's condition has worsened," he explained gently. "It might be difficult to see." We understand terminal illness, Lucas countered. We've read medical journals. We've prepared for statistical probabilities. This isn't about statistics, Alexander said, kneeling to their eye level. This is your mother. Which is why we need to be there. Joshua spoke up with unexpected firmness. Please! Something in the quiet boy's plea reached Alexander. All right, he agreed. Get your jackets. As they drove to the hospital, Alexander glanced in the rearview mirror at the 5 identical faces. Despite their intellectual understanding of death, they were still children facing the imminent loss of their only parent. Their composed exteriors couldn't hide the fear in their eyes. It's okay to be scared, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Even adults get frightened about losing someone they love. 5 pairs of eyes met his in the mirror. Mum says fear is a neurological response that can be controlled through logical thought processes, Noah recited. Sometimes, Alexander replied carefully, it's okay to just feel what you feel, even if it isn't logical. The boys seemed to contemplate this novel concept as the hospital came into view. Alexander parked in the reserved space the hospital administrator had arranged, then turned to face them. Before we go in, I want you to know something, he said, choosing his words with unusual care. No matter what happens today, you won't be alone. I'll make sure you're taken care of. It wasn't a promise of fatherhood, not exactly, but it was. More than he'd been prepared to offer 24 hours earlier. Lucas, the eternal spokesman, nodded solemnly. We understand. But as they walked toward the hospital entrance, Alexander felt a small hand slip into his. Joshua, the quietest of the 5, had reached out for connection in this moment of uncertainty. Alexander closed his fingers around the small hand, feeling something shift inside himself as they walked together toward whatever awaited them. Elena's hospital room had transformed in the hours since their morning visit. Medical equipment now crowded the space, monitors beeping softly, IV stands looming like sentinels. She lay still against the pillows, her breathing shallow, her skin bearing the waxy pallor that Alexander recognized from his mother's final days. The boys entered with uncharacteristic hesitation, their synchronized movements faltering as they absorbed the visible decline in their mother's condition. Elena's eyes fluttered open. "My stars," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Come closer." They approached her bed, no longer in their usual perfect formation, but clustered together as if drawing strength from each other. Alexander remained by the door, allowing them this moment. "Mom," Lucas began, his composure wavering, "your oxygen saturation is low." A small smile touched Elena's lips. Always observant. She lifted a trembling hand to touch his cheek. "Listen carefully, all of you. I need to tell you something important." The 5 boys leaned closer, their identical faces intent. "You've always been taught to value logic over emotion," Elena said, each word requiring visible effort. "I believed that was the right approach, but I was wrong." Surprise registered on 10 identical eyes. "Love isn't logical," she continued. "Neither is joy or grief or wonder. But they're what make life worth living." Her gaze moved to Alexander, standing silent. "Witness to this deathbed revelation. I want you to learn that, to feel everything, not just think everything." "But you said," Ethan began. "I know what I said," Elena interrupted gently. "Parents make mistakes too, even scientific ones." She squeezed his hand. "Promise me you'll try." "We promise," they answered in unison. Elena's eyes found Alexander. Again. "May I speak with you alone for a moment?" The boys reluctantly stepped back, moving to the far corner of the room where they huddled together, 5 identical profiles outlined against the window. Alexander approached her bed, struck by how quickly death was advancing. The brilliant scientist who had defied natural limitations created life through sheer intellectual determination, now succumbing to the most basic biological truth. They need someone who understands them, Elena whispered when he bent close. Someone whose mind works like theirs. I made them brilliant, Alexander, but I didn't know how to help them be children too. I'm not exactly an expert on childhood, he replied dryly. No, she agreed with a ghost of her former sharpness. But you recognize what's missing in them because it was missing in you too. The observation was uncomfortably perceptive. I've made arrangements, she continued. Legal documents naming you as their guardian, my research notes, their medical records, educational assessments, everything is organized for you. Always efficient, Alexander noted, earning another faint smile. In my apartment there's a false wall in my closet, Elena murmured, her voice fading. Behind it are files, my complete research on the technique that created them. The theoretical applications go far beyond fertility treatments. It could revolutionize regenerative medicine, genetic disorders. It's worth billions. I'm giving it to you. Alexander stared at her. Why? For them, she answered simply. Use it to secure their future. The scientific breakthrough will be your justification for keeping them. When people question why Alexander, Harrington suddenly became guardian to 5 children. Her insight into his world, the corporate politics and public perception he navigated daily, reminded him of why he'd once respected her professionally. Elena, what you did was unforgivable, she finished for him. I know. I violated your autonomy, used you as a means to my end. Her eyes, though clouded with pain, remained sharp. But they are innocent of my sins. I know that, Alexander said quietly. Elena's breathing became more labored. They're not just experiments to me, Alexander. Never think that. They're my miracles, my stars. Tears slipped down her hollow cheeks. I thought we'd have more time. Alexander found himself taking her fragile hand, offering what comfort he could to this complicated woman whose brilliant, misguided actions had irrevocably altered his life. I need you to promise me something, Elena whispered, her grip surprisingly strong. Don't let them forget how to be brothers. Their bond is unique, 5 identical minds that understand each other completely. Don't separate them, no matter what. I won't, Alexander promised, surprising himself with his certainty. Elena's gaze drifted to her sons, still clustered by the window. Let them come back now. There isn't much time. Alexander motioned to the boys, who returned to their mothers' bedside with measured steps that betrayed their effort at control. My brilliant boys, Elena murmured, reaching for them with trembling hands. Remember what I told you. And remember that I love you. All of you. Always. We love you too, Mom, Lucas replied, speaking for all of them as tears began to track down 5 identical faces. Elena smiled, a moment of genuine peace lighting her features. Take care of each other, and maybe, she glanced at Alexander, maybe try to help your father learn how to be a dad. It was the first time she had named him as their father in the boys' presence. 5 heads turned toward him, expressions ranging, from confusion to hope. I'll try, Joshua whispered, the first to accept this new reality. Elena's monitor alarm sounded softly. Her eyes closed as her breathing became more erratic. A nurse entered, checked her vitals, and stepped out again with a meaningful look at Alexander. The end was approaching. Can we stay? Lucas asked, his voice small yet determined. Alexander nodded. If that's what you want. The boys positioned themselves around their mother's bed, no longer maintaining any pretense of scientific detachment. Tears flowed freely. Now, as they held her hands, stroked her hair, whispered their love, Alexander stepped back, giving them space while remaining present. He found himself aching for these children who were losing their whole world, remembering his own grief when his mother died during his early teens. As the afternoon light faded into evening Elena Martinez slipped away, surrounded by her five. Miracles. The monitors flatlined, the persistent beep replaced by a continuous tone that hung in the air like an accusation against the universe's indifference. The boys didn't cry out or collapse in dramatic displays of grief. They simply stood, joined hands in a circle around their mother's bed, and bowed their heads in unified silence. The ritual seemed practiced, as though they had prepared for this moment together. Alexander watched, witnessing something sacred in their silent communion. After several minutes, Lucas looked up, his wet eyes finding Alexander's. "She's gone," he stated, the scientific certainty in his voice contrasting with the tears on his cheeks. "Yes," Alexander confirmed gently. "I'm very sorry." The hospital staff moved with practiced efficiency, allowing the boys time to say goodbye before quietly preparing to take Elena away. Alexander managed the necessary arrangements with the funeral home, signed the required documents, and provided his contact information for the hospital administration. Throughout the process, the five boys maintained their position near their mother, moving only when absolutely necessary, their identical faces solemn but composed as they honored her with their presence until the very end. When it was time to leave, they filed out of the room in silence, no longer in their usual perfect formation, but clustered together, shoulders touching as they navigated the hospital corridors. In the parking garage, Alexander faced a new challenge. His sports car accommodated only one passenger besides himself, while David had returned to the office to handle the business Alexander had been neglecting. "We'll need to call for another vehicle," he began, before being interrupted by Caleb. "We can sit together," the boy suggested quietly. "We've done it before." Without waiting for a response, the five boys arranged themselves somehow in the single passenger seat, smaller bodies on laps, arms around shoulders, buckles stretched to secure them. They fit together like puzzle pieces, drawing comfort from each other's presence. The unlikely solution caught Alexander by surprise. "Is that comfortable?" he asked doubtfully. Lucas nodded. "We're more efficient together than apart." Something about the statement struck Alexander as profoundly important, not just physically but emotionally. These five identical children had never known a world where they weren't part of a matched set, never experienced life as individuals separate from their brothers. The drive back to the mansion passed in silence, as the desert stars emerged against the deepening blue. Alexander glanced at the tangled configuration of boys beside him. Five faces with identical features but distinctly different expressions. Lucas stoic and controlled, Ethan analyzing the night sky through the window, Noah lost in thought, Caleb offering silent comfort to Joshua, who wept quietly against his brother's shoulder. When they arrived at the mansion, the boys made no move to disentangle themselves until Alexander opened the passenger door. They emerged slowly, standing close together on the driveway, uncertain in this new fatherless, motherless reality. "Are you hungry?" Alexander asked, searching for some normal question to anchor the moment. Five heads shook in unison. "Would you like to rest, or perhaps you'd prefer some time alone?" Again, they shook their heads. "We don't want to be alone," Lucas clarified, speaking for the group. "We need to stay together." Alexander nodded, understanding. "Of course." Inside, Mrs. Sullivan took one look at their tear-stained faces and wordlessly prepared hot chocolate, serving it in the library, where a fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace. The boys clustered on the large leather sofa, still maintaining physical contact with each other as they sipped their drinks. Alexander sat across from them, acutely aware of his inadequacy in this situation. What did one say to five grieving children who had just lost their only parent? What comfort could he possibly offer when he was still essentially a stranger to them? "Your mother was an extraordinary scientist," he said finally. "Her work was groundbreaking." Five pairs of eyes regarded him over steaming mugs. She was more than a scientist, Joshua said quietly, breaking his usual silence. She was our mum. The simple statement carried a profound correction. Alexander nodded, accepting it. Yes, she was, and she loved you very much. She said you're our father, Ethan observed, studying Alexander with scientific curiosity. Biologically, we understand the concept, but practically, it's complicated, Alexander acknowledged, for all of us. I didn't know about you until 2 days ago. You didn't know about me except through your mother's stories. What happens now? Lucas asked, his leadership role reasserting itself even in grief. Alexander considered the question, its simplicity belying the complex implications. What did happen now? His engagement was over. 5 children had entered his life through extraordinary circumstances. A woman had died entrusting him with her most precious creations. Now, he said carefully, we figure things out together, day by day. The answer seemed insufficient even to him, but the boys appeared to accept it, perhaps recognizing it as the only honest response possible. Can we sleep in the same room tonight? Joshua asked, vulnerability evident in his voice. We always sleep in the same room. Of course, Alexander agreed immediately. I'll have Mrs. Sullivan arrange it. As he stood to make the arrangements, Lucas spoke again. Mr. Harrington? Alexander paused. Yes? Mom said, we're Harringtons too. Is that true? The question carried weight beyond genetics or legalities. It was about belonging, about identity, about finding a place in a world suddenly reshaped by loss. Alexander met the boy's amber eyes, his eyes, and nodded. Yes, you're Harringtons. For the first time since the hospital, 5 identical faces showed a flicker of something beyond grief, a momentary reassurance that while one anchor had been lost, another might eventually take its place. 3 days after Elena's death, Alexander stood in her small apartment, surrounded by the remnants of the life she had built with her sons. The modest 2-bedroom space in a middle-class Phoenix neighborhood revealed more about Elena and the boys than any of their formal conversations had. The main room served multiple functions: living area, dining space, and classroom. A whiteboard covered one wall, filled with complex mathematical formulas far beyond elementary level. Bookshelves lined every available surface, organized with meticulous precision. Science texts neighbored philosophy treatises. Medical journals shared space with world literature classics. The kitchen was equipped with labeled containers and charts tracking nutritional intake. A small table bore 5 identical place settings, each with color-coded napkins, the only visible system for distinguishing one boy from another in their home environment. The boy's bedroom told the most revealing story. 5 narrow beds arranged in a star pattern occupied most of the floor space, their headboards meeting in the center like spokes on a wheel. The configuration allowed each child to maintain physical proximity while sleeping, their heads close, enough for whispered nighttime conversations. Above each bed, a small shelf displayed the only individualized possessions Alexander had seen. 5 distinct collections reflecting emerging personal interests. Lucas had astronomy references and star charts. Ethan's shelf held architectural sketches and design books. Noah displayed biology texts and pressed plant specimens. Caleb maintained a collection of small, mechanical parts and engineering diagrams. Joshua's space featured poetry volumes and notebooks filled with careful observations of the world. They slept like this every night, David remarked, examining the unusual bedroom arrangement. All 5 in one small room when the apartment had 2 bedrooms. Elena used the second bedroom as a laboratory, Alexander explained, having already discovered the hidden research facility. Behind a false closet wall, exactly as Elena had described, he'd found her comprehensive notes on the genetic technique. that had created the quintuplets, along with ongoing research applications. The material was scientifically groundbreaking, potentially worth billions, as she'd claimed. But more valuable to Alexander were the personal journals documenting the boys' development from infancy, recording not just their intellectual milestones, but moments of personality emergence that distinguished them as individuals despite their identical genetics. She tracked everything, he murmured, flipping through a journal. First words, cognitive patterns, aptitude assessments. There are behavioral profiles for each boy, updated monthly. David examined the modest surroundings with a businessman's assessment. She could have demanded money from you at any point, threatened to go public with the story, but she lived like this instead. Alexander nodded, the paradox of Elena Martinez growing more complex with each discovered detail. Brilliant enough to create unprecedented human life, ethical enough to live modestly rather than exploit her creation, yet morally compromised enough to steal genetic material in the first place. They can't come back here, he said, making a decision. Have everything packed and moved to the mansion, every book, toy, photograph, everything. David raised an eyebrow. You're really doing this? Becoming father to 5 instant 7-year-olds? Alexander surveyed the small apartment where 5 extraordinary children had been raised by a single dedicated mother. What choice do I have? There are options, David suggested carefully. Guardians could be appointed, trust funds established. You could ensure they're well cared for without upending your entire life. They're Harringtons, Alexander replied simply, using the same words he'd given to Lucas 3 nights ago. The statement had become a touchstone, a mantra against doubt. The board is getting restless, David warned, shifting to business concerns. The Singapore acquisition fell through. The neural interface project is stalled without your input. And rumors are circulating about your broken engagement. Schedule a board meeting for tomorrow, Alexander instructed. I'll address everything then. As they prepared to leave, Alexander noticed a small framed photograph he'd overlooked. It showed Elena holding all 5 newborns, somehow arranged in her arms, her face radiant despite obvious exhaustion. The sheer love in her expression contrasted sharply with the clinical research notes documenting the same moment. Alexander carefully added the photo to the box of personal items he was taking directly to the mansion, rather than leaving for the moving company. Back at the house, he found the boys in the library, each engaged in self-directed study. They'd maintained their unusual closeness in the days following their mother's death, rarely separating more than a few feet from each other. Yet Alexander had begun to notice subtle differentiations emerging as they adjusted to their new environment. Lucas, the natural leader, had taken it upon himself to liaise with Mrs. Sullivan about their schedules and needs. Ethan had already memorized the mansion's floor plan, providing detailed navigational assistance to his brothers. Noah had discovered the greenhouse attached to the east wing and spent hours cataloguing its botanical specimens. Caleb had begun a methodical inventory of every electronic device in the house, and Joshua, the quiet observer, had started keeping a journal, recording their new life in careful script. I brought something from your apartment, Alexander announced, setting down the box. 5 heads lifted from their respective activities, watching as he removed the framed photograph of their mother with them as newborns. We've never seen this picture, Lucas said, approaching cautiously. It was on a shelf in your mother's bedroom, Alexander explained, handing it to him. The boys clustered around, examining the image with scientific curiosity and emotional hunger. We were very small, Ethan observed, likely below the 10th percentile. For newborn weight, we had medical complications, Noah added matter-of-factly. Mum told us we spent 6 weeks in neonatal intensive care. Alexander remembered the clinical notes he'd read in Elena's journals. All 5 had indeed struggled for survival in those early weeks, with Joshua, the smallest, given the lowest chance of thriving. Elena had refused to leave the hospital, sleeping in a chair between their incubators, pumping breast milk, every 3 hours, reading research papers aloud to them through the plastic barriers. "Your mother was very strong," Alexander said quietly, "and very determined." "She said we were her miracles," Joshua murmured, touching the glass over Elena's smiling face. Alexander studied the 5 children, examining this evidence of their earliest moments. In the 3 days since Elena's death, they had maintained impressive composure, continuing their studies, following their routines, grieving with the same disciplined approach they applied to everything. Only at night, when they thought no one could hear, did muffled sobs escape from the bedroom, where all 5 now slept on mattresses pushed together on the floor, recreating their star pattern from the apartment. "I have to attend a meeting tomorrow," Alexander told them. "I'll be gone most of the day." Concern flickered across 5 identical faces. "Mrs. Sullivan will be here," he assured them quickly, "and Mason will handle security. I've left emergency contact instructions." "We don't require constant supervision," Lucas stated with his characteristic directness. "We're accustomed to self-directed activity." "Nevertheless," Alexander replied, "I'll have my phone with me. If you need anything, Mrs. Sullivan can reach me immediately." The statement felt strangely significant. His first explicit promise of availability to these children who had entered his life so suddenly. "Will you be discussing us with your board of directors?" Ethan asked perceptively. Alexander blinked, surprised by the question. "How did you know about that?" "We researched Harrington Technologies after Mom told us about you," Ethan explained. "Your corporate governance structure features prominently in business school case studies. And your board will want to know why you've been absent," Lucas added with pragmatic assessment beyond his years. "Why you cancelled the Singapore acquisition meeting, and why you terminated your engagement to Catherine Reynolds," Noah continued. "The daughter of Senator James Reynolds, whose campaign received substantial contributions from Harrington Technologies' Political Action Committee." Alexander stared at them, momentarily speechless. "You've been researching me." "It's logical. To gather data about significant life changes," Caleb reasoned. "Mom always emphasized informed decision-making. We understand if you need to prioritize your company," Lucas said with practiced stoicism. "Corporate obligations are time-sensitive." The statement carried echoes of Elena's scientific detachment, but Alexander detected the uncertainty beneath it. These children, for all their intellectual development, were testing boundaries, trying to determine where they fit in his ordered world. "The company is important," Alexander acknowledged, "but there are priorities beyond business." 5. Pairs of identical amber eyes watched him, waiting for elaboration. "I've made arrangements for Elena's funeral service the day after tomorrow," he continued, changing the subject. "It will be small and private, as I think she would have preferred." "Is there anything specific you would want included?" The boys exchanged glances, having one of their silent communications. "Mom liked stars," Joshua said softly. "She called us her 5 stars. She said stellar nucleosynthesis creates the elements that form all life," Noah added, "that we're made of stardust. She told us the calcium in our bones, the iron in our blood, the carbon in our cells, all were forged in ancient stars." Ethan continued, "When a star dies, it releases these elements to form new life," Caleb explained. "Mom said that's how the universe remembers." Alexander nodded, moved by this glimpse of Elena beyond the clinical scientist he had known. "Then we'll include stars in the service," he promised. Later that evening, after the boys had gone to bed in their makeshift communal sleeping arrangement, Alexander sat in his study reviewing the research materials he'd recovered from Elena's apartment. Her scientific breakthrough was genuinely revolutionary. a technique for genetic editing that could transform fertility treatments while potentially addressing hereditary diseases. If developed properly, it could become Harrington Technologies' most significant innovation, justifying his sudden guardianship of 5 children to a skeptical board. The irony wasn't lost on him, using Elena's stolen research to legitimize his care for the children created through that very theft. His phone chimed with a text from Senator Reynolds. "My daughter deserved better than this public humiliation. There will be consequences." Alexander deleted the message without responding. The political alliance his engagement had represented now transformed into potential opposition. Another complication in an increasingly complex situation. A soft sound from the doorway interrupted his thoughts. Joshua stood there in pajamas too large for his small frame, his expression troubled. "Is everything okay?" Alexander asked, setting aside the research materials. Joshua hesitated before answering. "I had a bad dream. About Mom." Alexander had no experience comforting children with nightmares. His own childhood tearful awakenings had been met with his father's stern admonitions about emotional control. "That's understandable," he managed, awkwardly patting the sofa beside him in invitation. Joshua approached cautiously and climbed up, maintaining a careful distance. "Mom would explain dream science," he said quietly, "how they're just neural processes consolidating memories." "Did that help?" Alexander asked. Joshua shook his head. "No, but I pretended it did because she wanted us to be logical." The honest admission created a small opening between them. Alexander considered his response carefully. "Dreams can be difficult," he offered, "especially after losing someone important." "Do you dream about people you've lost?" Joshua asked, his analytical mind seeking patterns. "Sometimes," Alexander admitted. "I lost my mother when I was 13. I still dream about her occasionally." Joshua's eyes widened slightly. "You lost your mom too?" "Yes. To cancer, like your mother. Did your father help you feel better?" The question carried innocent weight. Alexander's jaw tightened involuntarily. "No, my father believed in self-reliance." "Oh," Joshua processed this information. "Is that why you don't know how to be a dad? Because your dad didn't show you?" The startling insight from a 7-year-old caught Alexander off guard. "That's a perceptive observation." Joshua nodded solemnly. "Mom said observation is the foundation of scientific understanding." He hesitated before adding, "The other boys are awake too. We're all having bad dreams." Alexander stood up. "Let's check on them." He followed Joshua to the bedroom where, sure enough, 4 other boys sat in their star pattern of mattresses, attempting to comfort each other with their limited emotional vocabulary. "Joshua reported nightmares," Alexander said, feeling awkward standing in the doorway of their grief. "I thought I should check on all of you." 5 identical faces regarded him with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. Statistical probability suggested difficulty sleeping tonight, Lucas acknowledged, the slight tremor in his voice betraying his scientific detachment as a mere facade. Alexander made a decision, entering the room fully and sitting on the edge of the mattress arrangement. "When I was young and couldn't sleep, my mother would read to me," he said. "Would that be helpful?" 5 heads nodded in unison. "What would you like to hear?" he asked, glancing at the bookshelves that had been moved from their apartment. "Mom was reading us The Little Prince," Joshua said, retrieving a worn copy from his shelf. Alexander took the book, noting the dog-eared pages and penciled annotations in Elena's handwriting. As the boys settled back into their star pattern, he began to read, his deep voice filling the darkened room with words about a prince from a distant asteroid and the rose he had left behind. By the time he reached the chapter about the fox, all 5 boys had drifted back to sleep, their breathing synchronized in slumber as it had been in wakefulness. Alexander carefully closed the book and stood to leave. At the doorway, he paused, looking back at the 5 identical children created from his DNA without his knowledge or consent. Children who had abruptly transformed from abstract scientific curiosity into real, grieving, vulnerable human beings under his protection. "Good night, Harringtons," he whispered, before quietly closing the door. 1 year later, Alexander stood at the edge of his mansion's expansive backyard, watching 5 identical boys launch homemade rockets into the clear Arizona sky. Their precision was impressive, each rocket following a calculated trajectory, before deploying small parachutes that allowed them to float gently back to Earth. 3.2 seconds faster than last week's prototype, Lucas announced, stopwatch in hand. The adjusted fin configuration improved stability by 26%, Ethan added, making notes on a tablet. "The atmospheric conditions are optimal today," Noah observed, scanning the horizon. "Low humidity, minimal wind interference." "I still think the recovery system needs refinement," Caleb suggested, examining the parachute mechanism of his returned rocket. Joshua, typically the quietest, simply smiled as he prepared his rocket for another launch, his joy less analytical and more pure than his brother's. "Mr. Harrington, the board members have arrived," David announced, approaching from the house. Alexander nodded. "Tell them I'll be right in." The past year had transformed not just Alexander's life, but the very foundation of Harrington Technologies. Elena's groundbreaking research, now properly developed and patented under his company's name, had opened unprecedented avenues in medical science. The Harrington Genetic Modification Protocol was revolutionizing treatment approaches for hereditary diseases, with clinical trials showing remarkable success rates. The quintuplet's existence had been carefully introduced to the public through a controlled narrative. Alexander positioned as the forward-thinking innovator who had collaborated with the brilliant Dr. Elena Martinez on revolutionary fertility research, resulting in a unique family situation following her untimely death. The story had garnered international attention, transforming potential scandal into celebrated scientific achievement. Senator Reynolds' threatened retaliation had materialized in regulatory challenges, all of which Alexander's legal team had successfully navigated. Catherine had married a congressman from New York, their society wedding featured in the same magazines that had once planned to cover her marriage to Alexander. "Boys," Alexander called, "I need to meet with the board. Will you be okay out here?" "Yes, Dad," they answered, no longer in perfect unison, but with their individual timing and inflections. The words still caught Alexander by surprise sometimes. Not the formal father they had initially attempted, but the casual dad that had emerged naturally over months of bedtime stories, science experiments, and gradual trust building. Inside, the Harrington Technologies Board of Directors waited in the conference room that had been added to the mansion's west wing. Alexander now conducted most business from home, maintaining his corporate leadership while prioritizing his unexpected fatherhood. "Quarterly projections exceed estimates by 16%, he announced without preamble as he entered. "The first applications of the HGMP technique have received FDA fast-track approval, and the European markets are opening more quickly than anticipated." The board members, once skeptical of his sudden life changes, now regarded him with renewed respect. The company's stock had reached record heights, its reputation enhanced by both the groundbreaking technology and Alexander's personal story, which the public relations team had masterfully leveraged. "There's been another acquisition offer from Meridian Pharmaceuticals," one director noted. $15 billion, their third attempt this quarter." "The answer remains the same," Alexander replied firmly. "Harrington Technologies stays independent. The applications of Elena's work are too important to surrender to external control." His insistence on crediting Elena for the breakthrough that had transformed his company had surprised the PR team, but Alexander had been adamant. Her name appeared prominently on all patents and publications, her contribution acknowledged in every presentation. The boys' trust remains the majority shareholder, another board member confirmed. Yes, Alexander affirmed, their financial future is secured regardless of what happens to me. The meeting proceeded efficiently, Alexander's legendary focus now balanced with a perspective that had been absent before. Where once he had pursued corporate growth as an end unto itself, he now evaluated every decision through the lens of its wider impact. On patients who would benefit from the technology, on the scientific community, on the 5 children whose well-being had become his primary concern. After the board departed, Alexander found himself drawn back to the yard where the rocket launches continued. He watched from the terrace, struck by how much the boys had changed in a year. They still wore similar clothes, a concession to their preference for uniformity. But subtle personalizations had emerged. Lucas's watch, Ethan's architectural sketches tucked under his arm, Noah's plant identification guide in his pocket, Caleb's self-designed smart glasses, Joshua's notebook of observations. They had grown physically too, each gaining nearly 2 inches in height. Their accelerated education continued, but Alexander had insisted on balancing academic rigor with experiences Elena had never provided: sports, music lessons, social interactions with carefully selected peers who wouldn't be intimidated by their unusual intelligence. "Dad," Joshua called, spotting him on the terrace, "come see the new launch sequence." Alexander descended to the yard, where the boys eagerly demonstrated their latest innovation: 5 rockets launched in precise mathematical intervals, creating what they described as kinetic harmony. "We calculated the exact timing needed for optimal visual impact," Lucas explained proudly, "and minimal interference between flight paths," Ethan added. "The differential in mass requires precise adjustment of trajectory," Noah continued. "We redesigned the ignition systems to ensure synchronization," Caleb explained. "It's beautiful," Joshua concluded simply, his artistic nature complementing his brother's technical focus. Alexander watched the demonstration with genuine appreciation. "Impressive work," he commended. "Your mother would be proud." At the mention of Billionaire, their expressions softened. Her absence remained a presence in their lives, honored through the small memorial garden they had planted together on the property's eastern edge, where desert flowers bloomed around a statue of 5 stars, arranged in a familiar pattern. "She would have calculated the wind resistance more accurately," Lucas said with a small smile, their grief now tempered enough to allow fond remembrance. "But she would have approved of our methodology," Ethan added confidently. "And our data in collection techniques," Noah agreed. "Definitely our engineering approach," Caleb nodded. "She would have liked the colors we chose," Joshua said quietly, noting the distinctive hues of each parachute, a touch he had suggested to help distinguish the otherwise identical rockets. As the afternoon light began to fade, Alexander checked his watch. "It's nearly time for dinner. Mrs. Sullivan has prepared something special." The boys gathered their equipment with practiced efficiency, each responsible for specific components of their shared project. Their teamwork was seamless, the product of both their identical genetics and their lifetime of cooperation. Inside, the dining room table was set for 6, Alexander at the head, the 5 boys arranged around him. No longer requiring color-coded napkins to distinguish who was who, Mrs. Sullivan now recognized each child by the subtle personality traits that had flourished over the past year. As they ate, the conversation flowed naturally between scientific discussions of the day's rocket launches and more ordinary childhood concerns: Lucas's swimming competition next week, Ethan's architectural model for the science fair, Noah's observations of a hummingbird nest in the garden, Caleb's progress programming a home automation system, Joshua's latest story he was writing. Alexander participated fully, no longer the distant observer he had been in those first awkward weeks. He had learned to translate between the boys' technical language and more conventional expression, helping them navigate a world that wasn't designed for minds like theirs. After dinner, they gathered in the library for their nightly ritual. The space had been transformed over the past year, the formal leather furniture rearranged to accommodate their reading circle, shelves expanded to house both Alexander's business references and the boys' ever-growing collection of books. "Your turn to choose," Alexander said, gesturing to the shelves. Joshua selected a volume of Greek mythology, a recent interest they had been exploring together. As Alexander began to read the story of Perseus and Medusa, he glanced at the 5 identical faces illuminated by the warm lamplight. Their expressions, once uniformly serious and analytical, now displayed individual reactions. Lucas absorbed in strategic aspects of the hero's journey, Ethan visualizing the architectural elements of ancient Greece, Noah contemplating the biological implications of mythical creatures, Caleb considering the mechanical principles behind Perseus's weapons, Joshua simply lost in the narrative's emotional flow. Between pages, Alexander's gaze caught the photograph prominently displayed on the mantel. Elena, with 5 newborn boys in her arms, now joined by a newer image of the 6 of them taken at the boys' 8th birthday celebration 3 months earlier. The impossible family created through unauthorized science and extraordinary circumstances had become, against all odds, simply his family. Joshua shook his head. "I was writing about today. The rockets were really good." "They were exceptional," Alexander agreed. "I've been thinking," Joshua said, climbing onto the sofa beside him with the casual comfort of established trust, "about Mom and you and us." "What about us?" Alexander prompted when the boy fell silent. "Mom made us from your DNA because she thought combining her science with your vision would create something important," Joshua said thoughtfully. "But I don't think that's what made us special." "No?" Alexander encouraged. "No, I think what makes us special is that we have each other, and now we have you too." Joshua's amber eyes, mirror images of Alexander's own, held surprising wisdom. "Mom gave us life, but you're teaching us how to live it." The simple observation from a child, who had once been merely the product of unauthorized experimentation, struck Alexander deeply. In trying to help these 5 boys become more than their scientific creation, he had himself transformed from the isolated, emotionless businessman he'd been just 1 year earlier. "I think," Alexander said carefully, "we're teaching each other." Joshua smiled, a genuine expression unmarred by scientific analysis or emotional restraint. "That's what families do, right?" Alexander nodded, pulling his son closer in a half-embrace that would have been unimaginable to the man who had stood in the rain watching 5 identical boys at his gate just 1 year before. "Yes," he agreed softly. "That's exactly what families do." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.